closer friendship over the years than others. We were influenced by many of the same professors at Western, including Jim Cook, who had a deep influence, I think, on us both. I think the first class we had together was a Jim Cook-led class in which Christianity and literature, in which I got introduced to Frederick Buechner, and maybe that's when Jeff got his introduction as well, or maybe not. He's so well read, he probably knew all about him before that. But
I'm in grade school.
Is your mic on? Before Buechner even started writing books, you already knew. And for 2 of my 3 years at Western, I was the editor of the student publication called Poema, and I have a couple of bound volumes if you really want to find out more about it. But yeah, and Jeff was one of our regular contributors. So I asked if he'd write some satire for us, and he did a masterful job. Called the title of his contributions were always "Out of the Red Swamp" by Harry Longbaugh Jr. And it was just a tribute to Ring Lardner and some other legendary sports writers who I didn't even really know that much about, but Jeff did. And he.
If I'm not mistaken, Harry Longbaugh is the real name of Butch Cassidy, so that's why I went with Harry Longbaugh Jr. Just to let you know.
All right. Is your mic on?
Am I on?
No, you're not.
Where's our guy? He's not there. Hey, Judy. I think
He's got.
I've lost the power, it seems like.
All right. Well, Jeff's fiddling with his microphone. I'll say a few more things.
Hello. There we go. Okay. Better than ever. Oh yeah, the guy that put that on didn't do a very good job. That was me.
All right. Is it better now? And Jeff's, yours is working?
I think so.
All right. So Jeff and I also have a number of friends in common, friends we've maintained connection to since seminary. We both have an interest in sports, and I've had a long appreciation for Jeff's writing, and that has been most available in the Reformed Journal, an online blog that I think he's had a large part to do with since about 2012 and thereabouts. Yeah. So, and I attended a book release of Telling Stories in the Dark at Third Reformed Church here in Holland. It was maybe early this year. Mm-hmm. And I discovered that many of the people Jeff writes about in Telling Stories in the Dark are people I know. Many of them I was in, a few of them in seminary with, as was Jeff. And I took a 1-year internship. I went to Oostburg, Wisconsin, served at First Reformed Church in Oostburg, Wisconsin between my second and third years. And Gretchen's stroke happened at that time. Roger Nelson's dad was killed at that time. During that year I was away. And I found that Jeff's book just filled in a lot of the details that I didn't know about in both of those and some of the other incidents that are described in the book. And so I personally appreciated it for that, among many other things. There are things I relate to, and the whole idea of stewarding our pain that I could say more about, but I liked it enough that I recommended it to the retired men's group here called Gentlemen of a Certain Age, one of the retired men's groups here. And when you recommend a book to this group of 10 to 15 retired guys here at Hope Church, you're kind of on the hook for leading the discussion. So we ripped this book apart for 10 weeks this past summer. And then Jeff came in and had to defend himself.
It was rough. Rough group.
It really wasn't that bad. There was wide appreciation, and some of the men who are in that group are here this morning if they want to say more about it. But I think Jeff said last week he came in and the first comment was, well, this book wasn't as bad as I was expecting it to be.
You guys know how to give a compliment.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
what I said.
But Jeff's previous book before Telling Stories in the Dark was this one, Reading Buechner. And I wanted to ask Jeff a couple of questions. So this book, Jeff explores 10 essential books that Buechner has written out of his 40 or so, and he's written in various genres. So from the 10 that Jeff chose, one is a collection of sermons, one is a book about preaching, 2 are books about popular theology, 2 are novels, and 4 are memoirs, what Jeff calls slim memoirs. So in many ways, I think of Telling Stories in the Dark as kind of an homage to Buechner's practice and really his overarching practice of telling our own stories. And so I wanted to start, Jeff, is that a fair assessment, do you think, of Telling Stories in the Dark, that this would not have been come together without Buechner?
Yes.
All right.
We're going to move right through his questions.
I sent him my questions like 10 minutes before we got together this morning. It's kind of like a class, well, no, I won't go into that. So what makes stories of suffering redemptive?
I can't answer that one in one word.
Good,
Yeah, I have to. So, well, I think there is something redemptive in telling our stories for an audience that will receive them and listen to them. But I think more than that, it's making the redemptive move with our stories, and that was the fascinating thing that propelled me into writing this book, was to look at why do some people get stuck, it seems like, in their pain, and how is it that some others do wonderful things and help others. So that was what I became most interested in, was that idea of stewardship that Buechner writes about. But I wanted to explore that, interrogate that further, and look for people who had made that move towards saying, I think the redemptive move is ultimately to ask, as I said last week, is what do I do with this? Not the question of why that we get stuck on, but what do I do with this? And how can I use it? So when I think of redemptively, I think to help other people. How can this pain make me more empathic, make me more compassionate? Maybe in telling my story, other people feel, I think maybe one of the greatest phrases in English is, I'm not the only one, right? Other people have had this experience. Other people have had similar thoughts and feelings, similar pain. And so that's what I think of.
So I'm thinking about people I know who I've heard tell a tragic story out of their own life over and over and over again. And it's painful to listen to after a while because it doesn't feel like they've moved beyond it. Mm-hmm. And I think it's maybe that redemptive part of it that maybe they haven't sought to share or to think about.
Yeah. Yeah, how do you, so I just finished, there's a new book by Nick Waltersdorf, who we mentioned a little bit last week in Lament for a Son, but a new book called Living with Grief, which actually we explore the things that are in his new book quite a bit in chapter 9 of this book called, I think, Living with Lament. And Nick talks about owning grief as opposed to disowning grief, and that in our culture we get a lot of messages to disown it, to get on with our life, to get over it, to put it in our past. How do we instead own it, take it into ourselves, and let it do its work on us? So that's something that I explore over and over again. Yeah, I can't say here's the magic formula for doing that, but that's the stories. Those are the stories I was attracted to and the stories I try to tell.
And is there a distinction you would make between disowning our grief and being stuck in it?
Well, I think disowning our grief is one way of, so being stuck, there's different things that people do. One is you get trapped there. And so Buechner, in his essay that started me on this path called Adolescence and the Stewardship of Pain, he uses the example of the character from Charles Dickens' book, Great Expectations, Miss Havisham, who sits in her bridal dress with her wedding cake moldering away. She's stuck. She's absolutely stuck in the pain, jilted at the altar and is stuck there. So that's one way that kind of I don't know what the right word is, dysfunctional way. Others try to pretend it didn't happen. Just to, and Nick uses the example of you'll meet someone, you talked about people who tell you the same story over and over, but there are other people that you might know that something tragic has happened. They'll tell you their story and never mention it. You're like, well, didn't your spouse die? Well, yeah, that happened, but you know, so pretending it doesn't exist, trying to bury it, getting stuck in it, those are different coping mechanisms that people have that ultimately don't work for them.
Yeah.
They're ultimately not healthy.
Last week you told us, you know, the story of Gretchen, your wife Gretchen's stroke a month before you were to be married in the summer of '85. And you tell that story in Telling Stories in the Dark in greater length than you did in your book, Reading Buechner. Mm-hmm. And you actually apologized in this book for not telling more of the story because, like you said, people were wondering what happened to Gretchen or how's Gretchen doing.
Yeah.
And,
We just moved on. Yeah. It's modeling it out.
so I'm wondering if you ever get tired of telling that story, and if Gretchen, who's been here both weeks, ever gets tired of hearing that story.
The answer to both those questions is yes. But I can tell you a little background on the difference between the two books. So when I wrote, and that was one of the things that pushed me on the path with this book. When I wrote Reading Buechner, I had a contract with InterVarsity Press, and the way that IVP did it was I wrote the whole manuscript and then sent it off, waited maybe 6-8 weeks, and then got this huge file with all these revisions and the editor telling me all these things. And one of the things that he said was I had started with the story of Gretchen's stroke because that was how Buechner had really changed my life. And he said, this is a book about Buechner, not about you. We got to make this story half the size that it is right now. So we cut all this stuff about Gretchen out of it so we could get on to Buechner. Well, then the book came out, and inevitably people would come up to me and they would say, yeah, that stuff about Buechner was kind of interesting, but I was really interested in what you wrote about Gretchen and about her stroke, and I don't know what happened to her. So I was like, I got to do another book where we can tell the story and set it straight, right? Mm-hmm. And it changed my approach to this one too, where I wanted to not necessarily have that much editorial input as I went, because I disagreed with him. But what are you going to do?
Stupid editors.
Yeah, I know they don't know anything.
No, they don't.
Which is why I'm editing 2 books right now because I'm living it out. Yeah. So anyway, to your yes, I do. I'm telling that story now because I've been going around a little bit and talking at different churches, but it's not necessarily part of the repertoire. It's not going to be.
Hi, I'm Jeff Munroe, and nice to meet you, and let me tell you about my...
Right. It's not going to be, we're not going to talk about it at Thanksgiving on Thursday, right?
All right. You begin your book quoting Richard Rohr, saying, those who do not transform their pain are bound to transmit it.
Yes.
And then there's another quote from Charlie Chaplin that follows that you didn't really explore with us last week that I recall. Maybe you did and I wasn't paying attention, but he says that to truly laugh, we must take our pain and play with it.
Yeah,
to truly laugh, we must take our pain and play with it. Can you explain what that quote means?
Well, think about Chaplin's great character, the little tramp. That's a character born out of sadness, right? There's pathos there. And he modeled that in the humor that he did. And there are a lot of comedians, if you pull back the layers of their lives, are deeply unhappy people that have had horrible things happen to them. But what I particularly liked about that quote with Chaplin was that it demonstrates one of my core convictions, which I did mention last week from Viktor Frankl, that between stimulus and response there's a space. And that how we respond to events isn't a given. It is up to us how we respond. So that when he says to take your pain and play with it means that you're conscious instead of just unconsciously going forward in what you're doing. We do a lot of living unconsciously, but this is a conscious decision, conscious movement.
So tell us some of the things you've learned in writing this book.
I learned a lot.
Some of the things.
Yeah.
Not how
I
much.
learned all the stuff that's in here. Well, no, one of the things I learned was, so one of the people I interview is Marilyn McIntyre. If you folks, you are Marilyn McIntyre's people, you would love Marilyn McIntyre. She has probably 20 or so books, Caring for Words in a Culture of Lies, Speaking Peace in a Climate of Conflict. She has beautiful books called Word by Word and What's in a Phrase that just look at, word by word, looks at words and does like 7 meditations for a week on different words. And What's in a Phrase looks at little Bible, little, just maybe 3 or 4 words together from a Bible verse and expands on those. So she's a wonderful writer. You all should explore Marilyn McIntyre. Go online, find her, get her books. One of the things that she said, I used her as one of the subject matter experts. One of the things she said is grief is a palimpsest. Now,
I had to look up that word.
I did. Yeah, so there are a few people here that didn't have to look, that don't have to look up that word, that know that word. Oh, the subtitling said something funny? Oh, palimpsest, palimpsest, polyps, limpzest. That's perfect. Yeah. Polyps, yeah.
See, even AI doesn't understand the
No,
word.
it doesn't. This is beyond AI. So I did have to look up the word. You know, it's so funny because I'm like interviewing her and she says that. That's profound. I have no idea what she's saying. But when we finish, I'm immediately like Googling it. So in the ancient world, when you wanted to write something down, you couldn't go to Staples and get some paper. They had papyrus and scrolls, and so when they would want to write something, they'd have a manuscript, and then they'd have something new that they thought was more important than the old thing. So they would kind of try to rub out as much as they could on the old thing, and then write over it, write something new on top of it. And so biblical scholars and other scholars of antiquity spend their lives trying to figure out these documents, and they're called palimpsests that have these layers of things on them, and they use infrared, I don't know, I don't even want to, no, did it, really? Wow, I don't even want to look. They use infrared technology to try to figure out what's under whatever. So what she meant by that, though, is that grief is many layered, or has many layers to it, and that one grief inevitably brings other experiences of grief to the surface for us. That's why this idea of get over it or put it behind you is a false notion, because you'll never get over it. Something will happen. You'll think I've moved past whatever this was. Something else will happen, and boom, you're right there again. That thing comes back to you. It's not, you don't, you experience grief, you experience a loss. You may have a very intense sense of loss for a number of months, even a year, 2 years. it'll fade away, but something else will happen and boom, bring it right back. And so I had that experience earlier this year. A person in our church died, and I remember I was at his funeral, and his children were speaking at his funeral. And then I became conscious of the fact that I was no longer mentally at his funeral. I spent probably 5 minutes just totally tuning out what they were talking about. And I was at my dad's funeral in my mind, thinking about what I had said as his son at that funeral, thinking about what my son and my daughter said at that funeral. So that's what she meant, and that's one of the things that was a discovery for me, was that sense of layers. There's plenty of other things, but that's one that jumps out to me.
Give us one more.
Oh, I'll give you one more? Oh, darn, I didn't want you to. I thought you were going to say, we've got so many things to move on. So I'll tell you another one because you want to.
Tell them.
I'm talking to you,
Okay.
Terry,
No,
but
you're
all these people are listening.
I'm just your foil.
Right. One thing that I thought about a lot was race, which may not be something on the surface, but this gets to a question that I know you have because I looked at it at 9 o'clock this morning. Roger Nelson's story that Judy alluded to, where his dad was murdered in a church parking lot. Well, they're white. The person that pulled the trigger is black. The courtroom scene, which Roger describes, you had white people sitting on one side of the courtroom and black people sitting on the other side of the courtroom. And when the verdict is announced, the black side erupts in lament and anguish, and the white folks don't say anything. And it challenged me as I was doing this. There's another story that deals with race also. I just had to think deeper about my own prejudices, my own preconceptions, and then just think very carefully about how I wrote. And what I find is that, I know none of you have this experience, but what I find is that my children are a lot smarter about these things than I am. And so I would talk to my daughter who works in social justice and say, am I getting this? Am I anywhere close to right on this? Am I doing this in a way that's non-offensive? So that was another thing that comes to mind.
Do you want to talk about that more now or save it till later?
We'll come back to
All
that.
right.
Yeah.
All right. So you tell another very personal story in the book, and it's about your mom. Do you care to share that?
Sure. Well, my mom died from Alzheimer's disease in 2013, and my parents got divorced when I was a senior in college. The summer of going into my senior year of college, my dad and mom came to me one evening in July, and my dad said, I'm moving out of the house in the morning. It was a total shock. I'm sorry, but you can read this. Who is this woman that comes and she comes everywhere I go and heckles me often? I don't know about this. I'll try. Thank you. There it is.
You sure you want to leave that microphone on?
Yeah. Wow. What was I saying?
Your mom, your dad,
Yeah.
dropping this bombshell.
Yeah, they were elders in our church. They were, heavily involved in the life of the church, and so I could spend a lot of time talking about a lot of different things. My mom got remarried. She married her high school boyfriend some 30 years later, and there's a lot to that story too, which actually I just wrote something for the Reformed Journal about him that you'll be able to read in the middle of December to get more of the story. But when my mom got Alzheimer's, she was living in Southern California. I was in Michigan. When she got remarried, she moved to California, and I had a brother that lived out there. And what I would like to do, Terry, is just read a little bit, if I could do that, from this chapter about her with the Alzheimer's. Even after she'd forgotten our names, she still remembered the Lord's Prayer and other liturgical elements from church. Like many Alzheimer's patients, she remembered music. One afternoon we were visiting and I said, "Mom, do you remember this?" and started singing Amazing Grace. She joined in immediately. My wife Gretchen came in on the second verse, and then Chuck joined on the third. And by the time we got to "When We've Been There 10,000 Years," my brother, who lived close to her in California, also joined in from across the room. Tears formed in our eyes as we had this rare moment of connection. It was a sacred, holy moment amid a sea of forgetfulness. After a minute, my brother, being my brother, couldn't help but see what would happen if he sang the first line of "Moon River," another of her old favorites. And of course, she joined in. Maybe not as holy as Amazing Grace, but a moment of connection nonetheless. One night I called to check in, and after a few minutes on the phone, she asked me when I had become her son. On the day I was born, I said, you gave birth to me. Well, I'm sure I did if you say so. But where do you live now? I live in Michigan, I said, where you used to live. This is where I've lived pretty much my whole life. Well, I live out here, she said. A man named Chuck has been kind enough to give me a room to stay in. That's your home, I said. Chuck is your husband. She laughed and said, he's not my husband. Yes, he is, I said. Then I heard her say to Chuck, he thinks you're my husband. I could hear Chuck from across the room. That's what I've been trying to tell you. On one of our last visits when she was still at home, she and Chuck came over to our hotel to have breakfast with Gretchen and me. Halfway through breakfast, I smelled something off and saw urine dripping down my mother's chair. We did the best we could to get things cleaned up, but how wrong is that? I felt like crying. The loss of dignity is an outrage, but she wasn't even aware of it. Alzheimer's is a thief. It takes everything. It took everything it could from her. Despite Chuck's heroic efforts, she eventually required a care facility. The fog got worse and worse. The last few months of her life involved much suffering. The ease of the early stages was long gone, and I saw firsthand that Alzheimer's is a terrible way to die. I last visited her 2 weeks before her death. It happened to be on my 55th birthday, which wound up being one of the saddest days of my life. As I entered the open area of the care facility, I saw someone slumped in a wheelchair, a person in such bad shape that I averted my eyes. I glanced again and realized that person was my mother. She hadn't known who I was for years, so I didn't have high expectations for the day, but I was devastated by how much she had changed, or by how much worse she had become. She'd changed dramatically. She'd lost the ability to speak and lost the ability to hold her head up. She had aged decades in the few months since I'd last seen her. She looked for the first time in her life old. Her eyes were unfocused, gazing and searching, but not really seeing. I told her who I was, and I put my hand on her forearm, gave a little squeeze. Ow, she said. It would be the last word I ever heard her speak. This is how life ends for many of us. We imagine our lives as wonderful stories that are playing out like epic novels or movies. In the rare moments when we imagine our deaths, they're never like this. We see ourselves lying in bed with our family members gathered close, saying meaningful things and resolving all the unresolved tensions of our relationships. Or we see ourselves dying perfect deaths, painlessly and in our sleep at age 100. We don't imagine spending weeks or months or years in care facilities tended by strangers. We don't imagine dying with no knowledge of who our family is, incontinent, unable to speak or even hold up one's head. On that last day, I sought my own resolution with my mother. I was certain this was the last time I would see her in this lifetime. I'd gone out for lunch with my brother. When I came back, the staff of the care facility had put my mom to bed. I sat with her a while longer until it was time to head to the airport. I then knelt beside her and told her that I loved her. Told her that she'd been a great mother. Told her that I was glad that out of all the people in the world, she was my mother. I then choked up and said, Mom, I think you've done all you're supposed to do here. I want you to know it's okay with me if you die now. I don't want you to hold on for my sake or for the sake of any of us. Please don't try to stay alive on our account. I want you to go be with Jesus. You're going to have a better life, a much better, happier life in the presence of Jesus. I had mixed feelings as I said those things, simultaneously feeling it was the right thing to say and yet also feeling like a rat because I just said it's okay with me if you die now. Both loving son and betraying son, I put my hand on her head and said, Mom, I want to pray. The first words out of my mouth came as a surprise to me. I said, Lord, forgive us our sins. Why would I say that? I have puzzled over those words for a long time. Years later, I would learn from a hospice chaplain that there are 4 basic questions as people face death. Do I love you? Do you love me? Do I forgive you? Do you forgive me? So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. A friend once said that the experience of being human breaks every heart. The name of this friend is Tom Bogart, actually. So it was in a message he gave at the seminary. As a result, all we have to give each other are pieces of our broken hearts, and they are never enough. There's much wisdom in his words. We want to be known and loved completely, but we never are. We long to love our family members fully, but never do. Whatever we do, it's never enough. We never are loved enough. We never love enough. We are imperfect lovers, needy people, never fully satisfied, never fully known, always wanting and needing more than those around us can give. And so at my dying mother's bedside, I surprised myself by praying, forgive us our sins. We do the best we can, but it is never enough. I understand that generational conflict and trauma in many families far outweighs ours. My family story is not marked by abuse or negligence or abandonment, and I suppose I was asking more for forgiveness for sins of omission rather than commission. But my mother never talked to me about my father and the pain of her divorce. She never spoke meaningfully about her marriage to Chuck. And although she was their primary caregiver, she bore the decline and eventual deaths of her parents silently. I felt I had her approval and blessing, but she never asked many questions about my life or my work. We didn't ever talk in depth about what mattered most. So at her bedside, I prayed, forgive us our sins, not just for the thoughtless and hurtful things we'd said and done over the years, but more than that, for never being all we could be to each other, for never loving each other fully or completely. All we have to give each other are the pieces of our broken hearts, and they're never enough.
Thank you. Well, that's really touching. Thanks for being vulnerable, sharing that, honest. Yeah. Means a lot. And that's what your book does over and over and over again, like 10 chapters worth. And it's really remarkable and meaningful, helpful. And I know that in our experience in gentlemen of a certain age reading this, every Thursday, or just reading it and come prepared every Thursday morning to discuss it, I got about halfway through and thought, wow, this is a draining book to read. And I think it was Jerry Sitzer who wrote on the inside cover that, you know, he sat down and read this in a single reading. I thought,
Yeah, he
wow,
did.
how can anybody do that? It's draining and emotional, but thank you for
Yeah.
kind of sharing that with us. Anything else you wanted to say about that experience?
No, but I hope it's not just a downer.
No.
Because as
If
the
that's how
subtitle
it
says,
sounded.
finding healing and hope.
Yes.
I really try to focus on where resilience comes from, and on hope, and healing through telling the stories, through being
Yep.
open
Yep.
with it. Yeah.
And you succeed in that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd like to, if it's okay, go back to the racism piece and some things you learned about racism. And I mentioned to you that this year Hope Church adopted a commitment to racial justice.
Mm-hmm.
And the vision statement of this commitment begins, Hope Church RCA is committed to racial justice as a core expression of our faith as followers of Jesus Christ. In a world of racial inequity and injustice, we seek a faithful path that resists complicity and strives toward justice and reconciliation. And then it goes on several paragraphs after that. And it occurs to me that, yeah, what we do is never enough, and yet it's important to do something and to work towards something, even though it's never enough. And so in 2 of your chapters, you deal with racism, with racial injustice, and one is the Murder Mysteries, which is about Roger Nelson's experience of his dad's death on the south side of Chicago back in 1985, I think it was.
Yeah.
And then the chapter following that, chapter 4, I think, Quinice's legacy. And I wondered if you'd tell us a bit, you told us a little bit about the story, Murder Mysteries and Roger Nelson's story.
Yeah.
Could you
Well,
tell us?
I'll tell you a story about that, though.
All right.
One of the things that Roger shared was that when the shooting had happened, they'd gotten his dad to the hospital. His dad was dead in the parking lot of the church, but they went ahead and took him to the hospital, and eventually the family figured out he's dead. You know, they're not able. They said we're not able to revive him, which didn't even register to them that he was dead. So finally, when they figured out his father was dead, Roger said he walked out in the hallway and slapped a wall and shouted out, "They killed my father." And he's embarrassed now that that's what he said, but that's what came out of his mouth. And there was an African-American woman that was a nurse that was sitting there that heard that and said, "I'm sorry your father died, but not all of us killed him." And there was another African-American woman who was a member of the congregation who walked over to Roger and put her hand on him and then said to that first woman, "Don't worry about him. This is my son." And Dan Rooks, who I processed this story with, said a really interesting thing as he was processing that, because he talked about the response of the first woman, which was an educated kind of response, or a seek at education. Seeking to educate, I should say, where, like, if only he understood, he wouldn't say something like this. And that's what we always have in our mind. If only these people understood, they wouldn't think this way, they wouldn't vote this way, whatever it is, they'd be different. And those attempts that we make all the time fail. And when the woman came over and put her hand on Roger, she was doing something very different, and that was much more of a relationship approach. And Dan actually thinks that the human touch may have helped kind of reset Roger's brain in that moment and take him out of where he'd kind of gone. And that there is so much more power in relationship than in education. So that was one thing that was very interesting and very helpful and a learning moment.
Yeah, yeah.
And then I thought you were going to ask me something about Quinice for a second too, but
I'm interested. You can tell the story better than I can, but that's a very local story.
yeah.
Happens in Grand Rapids largely, and so tell us a bit about that and what you learned about race and racial justice.
Well, the first part of it I tell is that Quinice's dad, who I worked with, Quentin, that when our daughter graduated from high school, he had a big van, and we had to get all these tables and chairs for her open house. And so I had rented them at a place, we were living in Grand Rapids then, and had rented them from a place. And he and I are driving, and we're going down Plymouth Avenue, and we get to Hall Street, where you cross right into East Grand Rapids. And instead of going straight, which would have been the direct route to where we needed to go, he took left. He took a left and started driving around East Grand Rapids. And I said, "What are you doing? Why are you going this way?" And he said, "It's not good for me in there." And I was like, "You got to be kidding." And he's like, "No, it's bad things happen. I don't drive in East Grand Rapids." And that was eye-opening for me at the time, and it made me angry. I want to do something about this. This is injustice. But it also, upon reflection, I think one of the things that he was teaching me was what the definition of white privilege is. I worked with a guy for years that I used to get in long, I would say, discussions or really arguments about what white privilege is, because he was like, "Well, there's no such thing. And the proof of that is that my in-laws came from Russia, and they had nothing, and they had no advantage in life, and they're white, and they made their way in the world, and so there's no such thing." And what I was trying to get him, I'd never succeeded. This is education, right? That never succeeds. But what I was trying to get him to see was, yeah, but think about this story with Quentin. White privilege is, I drive through East Grand Rapids without thinking about it. That's what white privilege is. I don't ever think about, unless I actually, on those very rare occasions when I walk into a room and everybody else is black, then I think about being white. But most of the time, I never ever have to think about it and who I am in this situation and what I should say and how I behave. And for Quentin, every day of his life, that's something that he thinks about. So that was an eye-opening thing. So his daughter contracted a childhood form of leukemia that has over 90% cure rate.
13 years old, 14 years old.
13, 14, 15, something like that, I don't remember. She was a great kid. I'd met her, and she was just full of life and energy and huge personality. She was going to be something. And they took her to the hospital in Grand Rapids, and she had to get chemotherapy. So it's a very common procedure that surgeons do, where they will insert a port into the chest, because the chemotherapy, it can't go into your arm, the veins aren't big enough. It has to go into the big veins that are in your chest.
A central line, Cindy calls it.
Yeah, right.
I do that all the time.
The doctor pierced her heart, putting the catheter in, and killed her. And so that's the story that we go into and talk about the family, and there's lots of complications in this story. And some of the story that I can't even tell in the book, because there's more to it than he's comfortable. They never got a settlement from the hospital. The settlement that they got was he had, at one point, this is months after they had hired an attorney, and the hospital started playing hardball with them, and that it was their fault somehow, not the hospital's fault, that this had happened. And it became so complicated and so confused that eventually he just decided, we're not going to do this. And the hospital said, well, the settlement will be we won't charge you for her treatment. This is true. And this happened in Grand Rapids, Michigan, at a hospital that you're all familiar with. So then, this is the story I processed with Marilyn McIntyre, because she's taught medical humanities for years. She's worked with doctors and physicians and had conversations about medical error. You know, Terry, you and I are seminary graduates, as I look around, about 2/3 of the people in the room are as well. We were not in class in seminary being advised about the liability insurance we needed to get. Doctors carry huge liability. Surgeons are never supposed to make mistakes. They do make mistakes. They're human. This guy didn't intend to do this, obviously, but it was an error. He made a mistake. We have a system that's set up, though, that he can't go to the parents and say, I would give anything to be able to undo what I did. I'm so sorry, because of lawsuits, and the nature of the system doesn't help that happen. So Marilyn and I processed that. And so then the question, this is an African American family, they're in a white setting, what does race have to do with this? And I've had people pointedly ask me, because Marilyn brings it up, and they pointedly said to me, we can't prove that this is racist behavior. And I said, well, I don't think I'm trying to prove that. Yet, what we have to say is, for reasons we can't fully comprehend, people of color have negative outcomes in our healthcare systems and in lots of other systems, much more than white people do. You know, it goes back to, I'll just give you another one, because I just read this the other day, thinking about with Roger's story, and we were getting into prison and what's going on in the prisons in our country, that if African Americans had the same incarceration rate as white people, the prison population in our country would be reduced by 40%. Just mind-boggling statistics. So these are the kinds of things, I just want to get those out there. I'm not trying to draw a conclusion to say that this was racist behavior, but to say we've got some horrible disparities in our country that people need to address, people need to be aware of.
So finish off with how Quentin and his family and his community responded to this.
Well, are you talking about what I didn't write? I can't remember.
I mean, you referenced some things
Yeah.
about, you know, what we as white people have to learn from the black community in processing
right.
these
okay,
things.
Okay, yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, that funeral was the most emotionally wrenching funeral I'd ever been to in my life. First of all, you know, white people, we have funerals, we're all checking our watches. When's this thing gonna, you know, starts at 10:30, we gotta be out of here by 11:30, right? This funeral was 2 hours at least. And just weeping, wailing, lament, full expression. And I was a wreck. And I walked out of that, and Quentin sees me, and I'm just bawling. And he's like, hey man, it's okay, you're gonna be okay. And I was like, you're comforting me. This is the opposite. I'm supposed to be comforting you. This is the loss of your daughter. But that community has experienced tragedy in ways that the white community haven't, and has resources, more emotional availability than we have, that I think we could learn greatly from.
Yeah.
There's just much there that we could learn, because it was a horrific event.
Yeah. So we have a lot to learn from the black community.
Yeah.
Not something here, we're going to come help you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So we've got 10 minutes or so, Judy, is that right? To do some Q&A?
Should we have people with microphones
Norman up here, second row.
Oh, sorry.
Some people may not feel this way in this room, but I and many friends are feeling incredible grief politically. And this is helping me to think about putting that grief to work instead of living in it.
Yeah.
Well, I need to live in it, is what you're saying, but don't get stuck in it. And think about how I can use that to
Yeah.
reach out to make relationships, because you're right. Just talking and trying to educate doesn't work.
Yeah.
So just trying to reach out to those around me with love. Oh, that's all I think I can do at this point, but there is real grief and fear.
Yeah.
And it's hard to know kind of how to deal with that. So that's just me.
Yeah.
Good. Kevin? Yeah, David?
Thanks for sharing the power of telling stories. Is that on now? Yeah.
Yeah, it's on, you just need to be closer.
Okay. Should I eat it?
Well, no.
So I would like you to spend a moment talking about not right now telling the stories, but listening to the stories.
Yeah.
An ugly part of myself is that sometimes when I listen to stories, I'm thinking about a story that I can tell back.
Right.
And I don't want to do that. But I want to learn how to listen better.
Yeah. I learned a lot about listening from a member of this church, former member Stan Rock, who I had at Western, and he gave us language that my wife and I talk about a lot called asyndetic listening, where asyndetic listening is somebody says, I had a lot of problems with my father, and your response is to say, my father lives in Flint. You know, like, it's not it. Yeah, so Chuck DeGroat, who has the position Stan Rock once had at the seminary, uses the term compassionate witness. And I think that's what we need, are people that will be compassionate witnesses, that to tell our story, but to have it heard is very significant. And it's been one of the incredible, this is another answer to the question that I couldn't think of a good answer to when you said, give me another example. But one of the things I've just experienced through this book is having people tell me their stories, and there are just very powerful things, and I try my best to listen and not necessarily respond other than to say, I'm sorry that happened. Yeah, listening's very, very, very important.
Kurt, hold on, Jane, Kurt's next, I think. Or,
So this is a comment that I need to say for my further healing. It's an esoteric comment that kind of takes the whole thing in a different direction. But someday, I hope, I don't know how this will work out, but someday I hope to be able to write a meditation on the Shroud of Turin and unremembered trauma. To me, the Shroud of Turin is all about not forgetting our history of trauma.
Powerful.
interesting, yeah. Thanks, Kurt.
Hey, Jane.
Jane.
Maybe because I'm an academic past in my past life, but I want to put in a plug for cognitive understanding. I think that your story was powerful because of the combination of someone saying not all of us are like that, and then having someone who is not like that put her hand on your friend and say, this is my son, he'll be okay. I think it's the combination. We've spent this time with you, which has been great. I really appreciate it. And I owe you $20 for the book, by the way.
You're the one.
I got it. I think that you have given us cognitive structures in these two sessions. You've named a couple of things like white privilege. I think you've explained something of structural racism. When we have cognitive structures to hang our emotions in, or to better understand why we're feeling what we're doing and what we can do with it, it's that combination that's so powerful.
Yeah.
The emotions alone, I don't think, do it,
Yeah.
but the cognitive stuff alone doesn't either.
Right.
So I think
Yeah.
you're teaching us very well that both are necessary.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. That's great.
Thanks, Jane. Anyone else? Oh, go
Wait,
ahead,
no,
Dawn.
Dawn, I'm not going to go without hearing from Dawn. Stop it.
No. So you must have listened to many more stories than those that you called to put in the book. How did you weigh what ended up here and the others that you only are carrying, but continue to carry in your heart
Yeah.
instead?
I have a friend who keeps telling me I should have been in that book. And I'm like, yeah, you've had a lot of trauma. But what I don't say to him is, and you're still very stuck in it, which is why you're not in the book. I was trying to not just, I didn't want to have I think I mentioned this last week, the Pain Olympics. Who has a worse story? You think this one's bad, look at this one. But people who have made that move, who have done something redemptive with it, is what I was trying for. So, yeah.
One more, and we have to.
My hand was up at the same time as Kathy Brownson's because I had
Yes, you
exactly
were.
the same question that Kathy
Okay.
had, knowing that no matter what the outcome of the election was, there would be a lot of people who would be bereft and grieving, feeling that evil had won out over good. No matter what the outcome was, there'd be
Yeah.
people. I'm just wondering if you'd want to say anything more in response to Kathy's question. Do the principles that you've articulated, playing with your grief and so forth, have any application to our situation today?
Well, all I can say is I'm doing a bad job personally right now because I just quit reading the news since then. I've been in denial. But yeah, I do think, what are we going to do with this is ultimately the question. There's a lot of why did this happen, and unpacking all that, and you can do that forever. But what do we do now? Where do we go from here? How do we who are on the I would identify with those who are disappointed. I'd identify with Kathy. I know not everybody does. But those that are on the disappointed side, how do you live faithfully then? Those are all very important questions for us.
Kathy,
Something for adult education to consider in the future, perhaps.
Yeah.
Okay. One more comment. Do you have something
I
to
just
say,
wanted
Terry?
to give Jeff an opportunity to say, if people are interested in somebody else, another group of theirs reading this, how he might assist or what resources he has.
I have this book that I'd love you to use, and you can get it from me. This week I brought my phone and my Square, so I can take credit cards this week. And
Well,
Gretchen
this
takes
is the time
Venmo.
to express our thanks to
She doesn't
the
want me to
team,
do my
Terry
commercial.
and to Jeff. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next week we enter Advent, and our own Norman Burt will lead an Advent series on lectionary texts. Today is also Pizza Sunday. That means we need to line up 3 rows, 5 tables per row, 8 chairs around each table for pizza time. Thank you very much.
Not right now, though, right? Right now? Eat pizza right now? After church, yeah. Okay, yeah. Yeah, thanks, Terry. That was good. Hi.
May I buy a book?
Yes, you may.
Okay.
Here. I just thought you were randomly walking up to me giving me $20.
Yeah, because you're such a good man.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Anyway,
Judy.
I was
And-
talking to my son, Stephen,
You want one? Thanks.
who graduated from Western.
Oh, okay.
Stephen Vanderbilt. Oh, Mom, I know him.
Yeah,
So I just thought I should give him a book.
okay,
But,
great.
every everything last week spoke to my life.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, because his dad, my husband, died when he was 35.
Okay.
And all the things you said happened. I couldn't believe it.
Yeah.
I mean, you expressed it so well. So thank you. Thank you for doing this. And the whole thing on race, people really don't know because they've never been
Yep.
black.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you. Hi.
You have your square today.
I do.
I have your book in my armpit,
Okay.
and I am ready